Hello, greetings, and welcome to our Coffee and Conversation, Changing Climate, Changing Practice, presented by the James Romick Alliance for Craft. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Jamie Ann Jacobin. I am the Executive Director of the Alliance, and we are a nonprofit based out of DC that really focuses on the education, connoisseurship, and public appreciation of American craft. Today, I think you're really in for a treat. Our moderator, Erica Warren, is going to be introducing our featured speakers. Erica Warren is the editor of our Craft Quarterly magazine, which you may be familiar with. If not, you can find it for free on our website. She is also a professor at the University of Chicago. And prior to that, she was a curator at the Chicago Art Institute. So Erica is going to be moderating today. She's also going to be introducing our wonderful presenters. Erica, why don't we jump right into it?
Well, welcome everyone. Welcome and good evening. Delighted to welcome Kelly Church, Mae Colburn, and Ruby Lopez Harper, who have generously agreed to speak about their work and how through their dedication to craft, they are responsive to and mindful of the increasingly deleterious impacts of our human-made climate crisis. In terms of the format for today's program, I will briefly introduce our participants, and then we will chat away, leaving time at the end for questions from you, our audience. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the program as they come to you during the conversation, and you can do that via the chat, and I'll at the end, we'll go back over that. So now to introductions. Kelly Church is Anishinaabe from Michigan. Her heritage shapes her artistic practices, and her experiences as a Native woman artist shape her creations. Mae Colburn uses the vocabulary of rag rug weaving to examine the expressive, connective potential of fabric and thread. Through teaching and learning and collaborations and partnerships, she also explores the social dimensions of rag rug weaving. She collects her rag rug weaving activities under the name Common Loom. And Ruby Lopez Harper is the Executive Director of the Craft Emergency Relief Fund, also known as SURF Plus. As a longtime nonprofit arts advocate, she has worked with national service organizations such as the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response, Grantmakers in the Arts, and Americans for the Arts. She works on projects with the Association of Tribal Archives, Libraries, and Museums, and is an adjunct professor with George Mason University. Kelly, Mae, and Ruby, thank you all for the work that you do and for being here today to share space, as well as your experiences and ideas. With that, I want to start off with a question for all three of you. And during this, I'm just going to share a PowerPoint just to show our audience some of the work that you do. So I'll be going with, through the slides, and they'll start with Kelly, your work, and then Mae's, and then a slide from Ruby. So my first question for you all is, through your work, all of you are shedding light on environmental issues. How do you hope that your practice influences others?
I'll answer. My answer to that is I hope that my practice makes others think about how we can collect seeds to keep trees growing for future generations. We have so many different invasive species that are affecting our trees here in the US today. In particular, I work with ash trees, and the black ash tree in particular, to weave these baskets. The emerald ash borer was brought over inadvertently on some ash pallets from China, and it has been killing the entire ash resource of North America. We now also have the pine beetle in Colorado that is moving our way. So there are many different species to be aware of that are decimating our forests. And we can't regrow our forests as quickly as they're being decimated, but we can look ahead to our future generations. And one of the things we can definitely do is collect seeds and talk about the importance of collecting seeds, the importance of trying to prevent the invasive species. And seed collection can also be stored at our seed bank in Fort Collins, Colorado. And that's something else that we can all be educated about.
I can go next. Hello, it's nice to be here among many new friends. I'm nervously holding onto this ball of fabric strips. So yes, I work with rag rug weaving, and I guess I would enter this question by saying that rag is a bit of a tricky word these days. Most textiles that are thrown away don't really get to the point of being worn out before they're discarded. So I generally describe the textiles I work with as worn, surplus, or discarded. And this is to say that the, one aspect of my work is dealing with surplus. To put this in context, here in the US, people throw away around 16 billion tons of textiles every year. So it's a gigantic conundrum, this question about textile surplus. I, of course, work on a teeny tiny scale as an individual. That's part of why I appreciated this question about how we might influence others. So I would hope that my work would shed some light on our relationship to the old and the new, with some emphasis on, ingenuity surrounding what we can do with the surplus materials around us. I work with both some industrial surplus, so those are gathered from places like Fab Scrap here in New York City, and also a great deal of personal fabric surplus. So if we flip to the next slide, we'll see that part of my personal story is that my grandmother collected over 1,000 wool skirts in her lifetime. And there are still about 700 of these wool skirts in my parents' garage. So we are collectively trying to figure out what to do with these skirts. My parents wove many of them into rag rugs in the 70s and 80s. And so I'm, interested in rag rug weaving partially for that reason. And then in another aspect of my life, I work for tapestry artist Helena Hernmark. And among the many things that she's known for, she is known for her wall of wool. And so this is about 2,000 pounds of wool in about 3,000 colors. So similar to what I'm working through with my parents, I'm also working with Helena to figure out what to do with this wool, which is simply more than one person can use in their lifetime. So I really appreciated Kelly's point about being educated about, and I think there's also part of that in what I'm trying to do, being educated about textiles and textile surplus.
Ruby Lopez Harper. Sorry that I'm not on screen. I'm in Asheville and in the car traveling. So really excited to be here today. For me, I think it's really around normalizing conversation, that as we understand and recognize that climate-related disasters and resulting emergencies aren't going away. And in a lot of spaces and areas around the country, they're intensifying. And for me, it becomes even more important and even more relevant to have the conversation around readiness, around safeguarding, around planning, and making sure that this is just part of the practice, that artists everywhere understand and have access to reliable resources that allow them to understand how to embed this, just in the same way they understand how to market their work, just in the same way that they understand how to navigate commerce, and where to be connected, that this should be part of the DNA that they impart into their work and their practice. And so, yeah, I think when I think about that, that's been a lot of the bell ringing that I've been doing around readiness. And I think at the other end of that spectrum is also normalizing when things have to change or when things have to be sunset, and to take the fear of failure, closure, ending, change away, so that people can navigate that with dignity, and that we can honor, the humanity of the work.
Thank you all. And I'm really struck in all of your answers by the way in which this kind of like impulse to share the knowledge that you are gaining through your work with like the larger community of artists. And also, Mae, you touched on this briefly, but I hope that you and Kelly might share a bit more about the ways in which you use materials and kind of what informs these choices.
I can start with that. I am influenced by my ancestors, my native heritage. I belong to the Mechi-Benechiwish tribe here in Michigan, and I come from one of the largest black ash basket weaving families. So we have been weaving, as my grandma used to say, we have been weaving black ash baskets since before cameras existed. So we have a picture from 1919 of my family weaving baskets, but we were making baskets way before that. I like to say that we have been weaving baskets since before the country existed, because our practices started back then. So these practices and traditions have been carried through many generations. And today, as a black ash basket weaver, I look at my responsibility as a culture carrier and as a tradition sharer. But I also look at myself when I go into the forest, I'm able to identify the health of the forest as I'm harvesting a tree. It doesn't take a lot of trees to make a lot of baskets. One tree, depending on the width and diameter of it, can go a long way for teachings and for myself to weave baskets. But when I'm in that forest, I'm able to tell if the emerald ash borer is there, how many trees are dying, how far in we are. If there's not the emerald ash borer affecting the forest, when I'm looking for the ash trees, I'm also able to tell how the oak is doing and how the other trees of the forest are, doing out there. As the ash trees die, the water tables begin to rise. So there are a lot of different factors that happen from these invasive species once our trees start becoming decimated and dying. Our ash trees will seed every 5 to 7 years, but the emerald ash borer can kill an entire stand in 3 to 5 years. So there's always a lot of considerations to take in when I'm going into the forest. But the health of the forest is something that I can keep track of during my practices. Some of the more sustainable practices that I use for materials is sweetgrass. That is something that propagates very quickly. It would take over your whole yard if you planted it in your yard. You would never have to mow. How great would that be? And we can make materials. I can make hats from it. I can make different coiled baskets. So there are sustainable materials that will propagate easily that I'm able to grow and procure for myself. And then there are those that I go into the forest and I can look ahead to future generations and see how those will last for future generations. So I'm always trying to look ahead for what comes tomorrow, because there's so many that came before us to give us this knowledge, but there's so many tomorrow that deserve to have the same knowledge and the same opportunities that we have today in our forests.
I really appreciated how, shall I go ahead? Yeah. How in your description, Kelly, you're, describing situated knowledge in an environment and how a craft practice, an art practice really keys you into certain, the life of the materials that you work with. And I feel similarly about textiles. Rag rug weaving historically has been associated with thrift and even with scarcity, as textiles, would have been used, after maybe they're no longer functional as clothing. They might be used as insulation and then used as compost. At this point, we're dealing with a much different picture, right? As there is simply the superabundance of textiles, more than, any city full of rag rug weavers could possibly weave into rag rugs, and probably result in more rag rugs than anyone would ever need. So working in this vocabulary today is interesting to me for that reason. And when I'm thinking about weft fabrics to use, I like to be very open-minded. Of course, it's satisfying for me to live with and wear, linen and wool and other natural fibers, but when it comes to weaving rag rugs, I have to be open-minded to the polyesters and the spandex and the various synthetic and petroleum-based textiles, because those are really difficult to recycle, and those simply just, they don't biodegrade. And so extending their use feels like something of a necessity and a mandate. So in that sense, I have a lot of fun observing the interaction between these materials and my linen weft or my linen warp. I enjoy working with linen warp because it's very sturdy. It's also what Helena used, so I learned, I learned to weave from her. And in general, the production of linen uses a bit less water than cotton and other synthetic materials. So that's largely how my choices have been informed.
Thank you both so much for those thoughtful answers. And Kelly, I know, your work really takes account of and cares for future generations of makers and just people generally. And I wonder, and this question also open to Mae and Ruby as well, but like, what trends have all of you seen in terms of artists and organizations caring more for the environment?
Yeah, I was thinking about different places that I go. So when we do gatherings here to share our teachings, we are conscious of, not having a lot of waste. And so people at our native gatherings, we bring our own plates and our own dishes to eat on. And then we have a place where we can all wash them. And so we'll do that every day for each of our meals. And if people don't have that, then we will bring along extra ones for other people to share. Using biodegradable materials at gatherings as well is another option. And also these virtual events just like this, help cut back on our carbon emissions. I know it's in the greater sense of things, but every little bit can help these days. And so I see virtual events as reaching more audiences as well, because there's that opportunity to even I live very rurally, so sometimes these are very tricky for me, and today was a tricky day for me. But I always had the library available to me. So there are wonderful institutions that we have in all of our cities, like libraries, where people who don't have internet or very slow access like I do are able to access this information that is being shared out there. So I found during the pandemic that was something that was much more better for someone like me that doesn't have the access all the time to information or the ability to travel whenever I want to go attend something. But I think in the greater scheme of things, just sharing about, I love Mae's recycling materials. I love it. The art that I'm seeing from her that she creates is so beautiful, and it is horrible. My daughter speaks about it all the time. She's like, we don't need new clothes. There's such a big landfill of clothes. And then her speaking about the petroleum-based ones as well that don't biodegrade. Turning those into something is also a way of reminding us that we can reuse things. We're so used to having everything new. So I think artists that are recycling materials and teaching lessons in that way is another way that we can all think. Using our own bags when we go to the stores. There's so many ways that we can help in little ways and large ways. But I'm also learning today as I'm sharing with you, and I'm really happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you so much. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mae.
I appreciated this question, and keeping in mind that I live in a very, very dense, heavily populated area in Brooklyn. It's so alive with reuse, and it is so exciting to see all of the organizations that exist that make this possible. There was an event at Barnard College last year that was called Circularity Day, and it was celebrating many artists and organizations that are talking about this kind of sharing both knowledge and materials and For example, there's, Fab Scrap, which I've mentioned. There's Materials for the Arts, which is collecting materials that can be used at, public schools for art making. In my neighborhood, there's a place called Big Reuse, which is like, you can imagine Goodwill, but even bigger, even crazier and more exciting. And I love participating and being in dialogue with all of this. There's also, the much more, and I think this is extremely valuable, the more informal ways that people share and pass along through generations. Here in Brooklyn, a lot of people will leave things they're not using on their stoops or on the, on the street. And sometimes you just come across exactly that thing that you've been looking for. So those are all things that I celebrate, keeping in mind that, reuse is not a new concept. And even thinking back to like the earliest known examples of textiles, they're known through impressions in clay. And you can imagine that, scraps or rags of textiles were used in ceramic production. So, that's one very ancient example of textile reuse. And there are so many. I've even read about, and this, I just enjoy this fact, scraps of tapestries found in historic latrines, which suggests that, they had their final use at some point in the bathroom. But which is all to say, there are all sorts of ways in which things can be reimagined. And I think that's, imagination is a key component to everything that we're talking about today.
Thank you.
So from my vantage point, some of the things that I see, so the Craft Emergency Relief Fund recently divested ourselves of our office space. And I think as many have tried to understand what is next in the wake of the pandemic. And as an organization that's very cognizant of the impact of, climate on disaster, to be able to reduce our footprint in that way is really meaningful. And I think also understanding that that's ushering in a whole new workplace culture as well. On the other side, when I think about the practice, kind of more ecosystem, landscape, infrastructure, trying to understand the role and the place of makerspaces as a place where there's shared resources. So, folks, everybody doesn't have to have a kiln. Everybody doesn't have to have this equipment. Everybody doesn't have to maintain or draw on, specific, fossil fuel type of resources, like, hot shops for, glass artists. I think anywhere we can utilize the collective access to resource heavy type of equipment need does reduce that, and I think also helps kind of even and as we're thinking about what those spaces mean in the context of the practice and in the context of the larger landscape, I think is going to be really important as we think forward, that where we've placed a lot of importance on individual artists maintaining a dedicated studio, how is that shifting, and how are we thinking about the next, and where does that live, and how does that factor into the way that we're organizing how we understand craft as an art form?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up those shared spaces. I definitely have seen a growth in that. And I know just here in Chicago, I have an artist friend named Hope Wang, and she just is reopening a space called Loom Room, and she has a TC2 digital jacquard loom that she is making accessible to artists through kind of like a community-centered programming initiative. And I feel like it's so wonderful to kind of hear how she's trying to do this on a very small and sustainable scale, as it's just her and her colleague in this, Marat. But yeah, it's great to hear that you're seeing that happening more widely as well. And in thinking also about kind of Surf Plus, you all are serving and supporting artists through myriad efforts. And I wonder, Ruby, if you can speak a little bit more about how Surf Plus defines emergency and how your work engages artists and other stakeholders. Why provide this care and support artists, especially those with materials-based practices?
Yeah. So one, to kind of set some context, the Craft Emergency Relief Fund operates inside this larger disaster response ecosystem that includes other organizations that focus on either other facets of the artist community or organizational support. And we all come together as a group through the National Coalition for Arts Preparedness and Emergency Response. And so a lot of the definitions that we utilize in the work come from a collective discussion about how and what is showing up, who and how are different response mechanisms being deployed, how do we do better, how do we lessen re-traumatizing individuals in the experience of trying to secure our resources and access to funds. So the way that we define it, and I'm fairly new with the organization. I started in November, but having worked alongside Surplus for a number of years through the coalition, I think it's been really interesting in how the definition of emergency has been broadened. That, as we think about the impact of, the opioid crisis and mental health becoming a more prominent and open conversation. Certainly there's a lot of work still to be done. And then coupling that with what are the day-to-day emergencies that people experience, house fires, theft, certainly, physical health issues, and sometimes caregiving. Now we're starting to see more caregiving become a disruption in artists' practice and the sustainability and the stability of their livelihoods. And so we've also been grappling with what does that mean as we think about the future. And one of the strategic pillars that we've established for the next 3 years is really embracing our commitment to the well-being of craft artists and fostering a culture of care. So what does that mean? It's understanding the artist as a whole person, and what are the needs, what are the basics, what are the kind of non-negotiables for an individual artist in order to navigate through and just get to the other side, never mind the recovery process that can take a really long time, right? And so in that, also understanding that we're the only organization that does the work that we do, but we're one part of it. And as one part of it, what is our role in also kind of rallying everyone else in the craft community service structure to provide more resources, more information, more education, more connectivity, because in that, we get the information out to the artists, we normalize the conversation, they start the participation. We can't mitigate everything, but we can certainly help artists understand the importance of readiness in order for them to weather all of these unexpecteds, right? And where we know disaster that's climate related is happening on a regular basis, all of these things are very cyclical. What can we be doing proactively to get information out to make sure that the artist communities that exist in those spaces are prepared and informed, and that the service structure around them knows that these resources are available as well? So I think there's a lot still to be done. And then there's always the realization that we're one organization with 8 people and we don't have infinite resources. And so really prioritizing, but not losing sight of this larger conversation and our larger ability to amplify, signal boost, leverage, convene, push, question, and lead by example. So.
Thank you so much. That was such a thorough and full answer. And I feel like all of the support that you provide and the advocacy and the education, right? To support artists is so important, because as I think we've heard from today from Kelly and Mae, artists are really innovative thinkers, and you're addressing what's impacting them, and then that way they can be empowered to focus on themselves and also kind of their work, which is in fact really a powerful way to address the climate crisis. And this care is so important. And May, I want to kind of come to you and on this theme of care and in your contribution to the recent Craft Quarterly. This really struck me. You noted that you respond to the materials that you're working with. And I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on how your process cares for materials and the memories embedded within them, and how we might think of this as serving as a guide or example or model for other artists and other people.
This is such a very humbling question. It's such a very nice and big question. So when I first read it, I thought, okay, well, I connect care to use. And so caring for something is keeping it in your life, finding ways to interact with it, keeping textiles, close to yourself, is one way to do that. I think some of my happiest commissions are those rugs that are going to homes with dogs or cats or babies or, beings that may not have the kind of, I don't know what you might call it, but like the adult relationship with precious things quite worked out yet. So they end up being used in all sorts of surprising ways. And I think along those lines, I just really love working with things that have been used, that show evidence of, the various things that human bodies excrete. Skin cells, whenever I rip up a sheet, I find all sorts of, bits of the epidermis that kind of burst out like that. And so there's a lot to learn. I think that, rag rugs could be seen as archives. It's a way to compress fabric and, put it in a warp and then, keep it there for a while. I would also say along these lines of use that there's something about knowledge use. A thing can be useful in the knowledge that it provides and affords. And when you brought up guides, I've had a great summer, and it's been a summer filled with guides, I would say. So people who are finding ways to combine research and making, that's something I'm always looking for. It's been kind of hard. That can be a tricky position to inhabit. It can be kind of hard to explain yourself, but this summer I saw a great exhibition in Ithaca by the artist Marie Watt, Blanket Stories. So all of these wool blankets, each of which contain their own stories, piled high into big sculptural forms. I read the book All That She Carries by Taya Miles, which traces the story of an embroidered sack through 3 generations of Black women, from an enslaved mother to her daughter, given to her daughter as she was being sold. And that's an incredible book that really does give voice to this sack. There's a Norwegian artist maker, Annemor Sandbø, who is a friend of my mother, and she bought one of the last shoddy mills in Norway. And shoddy is, wool is kind of ground up and then made into new yarn. And in doing so, she documented all of these old wool sweaters, which is really, all 3 of these examples that I given, these are people who are just spending time with objects and really taking the time to document and learn from them and share their stories. So that would be that's the inspiration that I find so exciting, and that I would hope to embody in my work too.
Thank you. And yeah, I'm gonna have to look up about this shoddy mill. That's fascinating. But for the moment, I want to think about how, all 3 of you teach as part of your artistic practice, or as part of your efforts. And I wonder if you could each speak a little bit about how the climate crisis has shaped and or impacted your pedagogy. Kelly, I wonder if we might start with you.
Yes, the climate crisis is definitely affecting the way that I teach in many ways. So one of the ways that it's affecting it is the materials that I'm able or not able to harvest. So with black ash, we used to be able to just go about 15 minutes down the road, get a log, bring it home, and we would work with it. And as I said, it doesn't take a lot of logs to make a lot of baskets, but it takes that knowledge and the place to find your logs. And a good basket tree has certain characteristics. So let's say there's 100 black ash trees, maybe less than 10% will be good for actual basket weaving. So it's just not any black ash tree. So it's changed my teachings in the way that when I get a tree now, half of it will be for teaching and half of it will be for myself. So I can weave my baskets to share my stories, but also it's very important to continue to pass on these teachings as long as we are able to. I like to say it's bringing back some blood memories from past generations, but it's also creating those future blood memories for our future generations. Because when we are unable to harvest the black ash tree, maybe for a decade or two until we replant the seeds, we still need that knowledge practiced until that time comes. And I'm hoping that time won't come. But we need to be prepared and look ahead for what things may happen and how we can look ahead and be proactive look ahead so we can be proactive with the seeds, the seed planting, and make sure that things continue. Another way that I have looked ahead is that if we do lose these teachings for a generation or two, then we're also looking at, is it as easy as riding a bike? We can't just jump back on that bike. We have the harvesting process, the knowledge there. You need to know what your trees look like, the characteristics of a good basket tree. Then you have to procure the tree, which means we have to pound on it. We split those growth rings in half and we scrape them. So while this is a knowledge that has been passed on infinitely for thousands of years, we are looking at a time where we may not have it for a few decades. So in that respect, I have been recording the steps with technology of today. Now, I'm not very tech savvy at all, but I am able to take my camera, the video on my camera phone or a video player and record us pounding on a log. How does that sound? The sound of pounding is part of how you teach. If you are pounding correctly, it resounds and it will echo for, a quarter mile down the road. If you're not pounding correctly, it will make a sharp noise and you won't get good materials. They will be split. So there's so many things that I'm trying to pass on with technology. So I have created some baskets that are part of the Renwick Institution. And there's one in the Art Institute of Chicago as well that have information that will be carried forward for future generations of Anishinaabe and Black Ash basket weavers to access the information should it be set aside or forgotten or not be able to be practiced because we do not have the trees anymore. It is written in our Anishinaabe language, so it kind of helps us also retain the language that we use for our Black Ash teachings, because first of all, who we all are is based on our language. The linguistics that we use as people is part of the basis of who we are. So the linguistics, as we lose our Ash traditions, we're also using the words and the languages. So it helps tie the two together. And it also targets a specific audience, the Anishinaabe people. But also the Wabanaki in the Northeast use it, the Haudenosaunee. So the Akwesasne, there is a whole group of us that collectively together use the Black Ash tree. We work together to try and save those seeds, save the teachings, and collectively look ahead for all future generations. But in this way, this is how I look ahead to try to make sure that what we have always had and what we have today will be available for those tomorrow as well.
Ruby, do you want to chime in next?
Sure. So, two facets of the teaching, much more in terms of administrative practice. So in a course that I taught for Drexel University around disaster preparedness in the arts, and then currently I'm teaching arts and community engagement at George Mason University, and really utilizing the ability to understand, research, and then respond. So knowing that, again, climate inflicted disaster is not going away, And so what does that mean for practice of community engagement? What does that mean when we're thinking about resourcing communities? What does that mean when we're thinking about, just being responsive and also being, aware of what else is a community dealing with? So, if you're in Northern California and you're trying to do community work, is thinking about the likelihood and the effect of a wildfire happening while you're executing a program, or while you're spending an extended amount of time in that community. Is that part of the program development that we need to be thinking about? And also, what then is the contingency plan around that? What is the the disaster protocol that you're going to put in place? Because I think even in all of this, we don't really talk about the what ifs. We just assume that like every program is going to happen and it's going to be blue sky and perfect, but it isn't. And there's always going to be something that we should be thinking about, whether it's, okay, well, if there's excessive rains, because we're going to be doing this amazing program in Ellicott City in Maryland, which floods on a regular basis during the rainy season, or understanding that you're in a floodplain and floods might move through, or it's hurricane season, you're doing something in the Midwest. What's this going to mean, and how does that affect people? Because there's a muscle memory to disaster that people don't forget and they don't lose track of, and it's also generational. And so even being, I think, sensitive and aware that a history exists in that regard as well. And how does that inform your practice, and how does that deepen your understanding of that community in terms of what they grapple with, what they've experienced, what they're thriving through, what they're stabilizing from, and then being able to tailor your practices in a really meaningful and deep way.
I've like piecing together multiple things that you've said, Ruby, about preparedness just now, and then also space. And those are two things that, of course, I think about. I have a studio in a shared space in Brooklyn. Studio space is this really amorphous thing. There's like a landlord and a landlord above, it's like also complex and so tenuous. And this is in a pretty flood prone area, as many studio spaces are near the water in Brooklyn. So let's see, space. I suppose that's one thing that came to mind with this question about teaching. I now have 2 looms, and this small loom behind me is actually the manufacturer described it as the school loom. I got it on Craigslist. It's from the 80s, but I bought this with the intention of teaching. So having more than one loom means that I can have someone come to the studio and learn. And so I've enjoyed offering what I've called free rag weaving, where people can come and simply gain some experience. Weaving is tricky, or weaving with floor looms is tricky because it's quite a bit of investment, especially in New York City. People don't often have space, and then figuring out all this equipment is very complicated. So just trying to ease that process for people. In general, the teaching I've done around the loom has been pretty informal, and I suppose that is some response, maybe kind of indirect response to institutional education. I'm very eager to make and celebrate places where people learn beyond the institutional settings. Skill building, collaboration. This loom had a residency last summer at a friend's studio, so we took it apart and put it back together. And with a group of 9-year-olds, we took the loom apart and put it back together, so learned about all of its parts, and we also wove both communally and individually. And yeah, in general, that has certainly brought me a lot of joy. And it's a way to also talk about textiles and surplus and waste with kids who get it. They really get it. They know what's up and what's going on. So
wonderful. Well, I wrote in the chat to please submit your questions. So please do that. And if you're having a hard time with the chat, you can raise your hand. We do have one question for Mae in the chat from Shauna, and and Shauna says, Mae, do you have any fabric source tips for folks who don't live in heavily populated areas and wouldn't have the resources that a city does? I sometimes think of sending up a flare on social media that I'm accepting used items like clothing and sheets, but are there other good sources for those of us living in more rural areas? I'm thinking in my area, thrift stores and yard sales are probably my best bet. Any recommendations? And Kelly, as you live in a kind of more rural area, you might also have insights to contribute here as well.
Let's see, yes.
It's a great question. And this is where, I think the internet is so helpful. I mean, the internet really does, it's filled with keywords. It makes things searchable. I'm a heavy user of Craigslist and Facebook Marketplace and all these other Etsy, can be another place to find things. And I love the idea of a flare. I mean, part of the huge joy for me in doing this, working with fabric in this way is that I get to meet people. So, who knows who you'll meet in the process, but it sounds like you've got a bunch of good ideas that will be worth pursuing.
Yeah, I hear a bunch of good ideas there too. I think that like I use vinyl blinds sometimes just to tell the story about, we could continue our weaving, the same weaving skills with the vinyl blinds, but we won't have that harvesting process, which is about 75% of what we do. But with things like that, looking at vinyl blinds, looking at any kind of newspapers, as a weaver, I look at all of these items that I can cut into strips, and I can still do the same kind of weaving that I do. But yeah, so that would maybe entail looking in people's recycling garbage. They might be having things recycled, looking there, but your secondhand stores and everything are some of the best places to go, where there's always something available. So I'd love to see what you're doing too, if you can post that in the chat.
Amazing. And Ruby also chimed in about posting in a central space like a coffee shop or library. Yeah, that's great. Libraries are amazing. Also, Ruby, in the chat, there's a question for you. Does your organization work worldwide or focused on the Western Hemisphere? Oh, and you chimed in there. That's great. And then Callie, there's a question. Oh, and Dee also has a question for Mae in the chat. But can you say more about the relationship of fabric to clay? I am a potter and we have our own environmental impact issues, but curious about the connection you noted, since I work with fiber sometimes as well. Yeah, the textile impressions in clay, I think, is what this question is referring to, like the ancient ceramics.
Yeah, so for that, I would recommend the work of Elizabeth Whalen Barber, a book on prehistoric textiles. And I'm not such an expert about this particular topic, but from what I understand, the earliest evidence of textiles are actually impressions of weave structures in, sherds. So there'll be more about this in the Elizabeth Whalen Barber book. And, I understand that it's some, it must be when the clay is before it's been fired, so as to make an impression in the, yes, Elizabeth Whalen Barber, that's correct.
Thank you. And yeah, there's examples of like carvings that are, carvings of textiles. So as a textile focused person, I always think like textiles are the ultimate artistic media, because in every other kind of material form, it seems like people are working to replicate textile structures. Kelly, Jamie Ann has a question for you. What generations are you usually engaging when you teach? And do you ever travel to teach different audiences?
Yeah, I actually teach ages of all ages. So 3 years old on up, usually they'll have their parents with them. You'd be really surprised what a child can weave. I might have to maybe help them with a few rows to make sure that it will hold together, but they really do grasp on. And this is the beginning of the making the memories with them. But we work with all ages, and we do travel. We travel all around the United States. I'll actually be traveling to LA in November. I'm traveling to Oklahoma in October, and Minnesota in September. We've come back from Minnesota We just came back from Santa Fe. So I do travel all over and share wherever we are asked. And we try to focus on our Great Lakes communities, or, our Black Ash communities around here. But all of our people don't just live here. So traveling is always necessary to reach the broader audience, and also to share some of the wonderful traditions that are practiced in this country that you might not know about, and how we can all help to sustain them by collecting seeds, not just the people who use the trees, but the ash trees that are being lost, or white ash and green ash that we don't actually utilize for baskets, but they're very important for our environment, for our birds that live in them, for shade, for so many reasons. So we can all contribute in many different ways.
Wonderful to know that you're going about and sharing your knowledge. And then Victoria in the chat says that she'd love to hear from each of you about how the responsibility you feel for addressing the climate crisis impacts your personal design aesthetics beyond specific work about the topic.
Yeah, I think for myself, every day, I'm thinking about what was practiced among our people because it was necessity. But today, it's not as much necessity. We can go to the store and we can buy something, but then that contributes to the overall, garbage piles that we actually have today, because not everything is made to last, but some of our basket materials were made to last a very long time. A black ash basket is something that can last for 100 years. And we still have baskets today that we utilize for those reasons. So making work, some of my work, most of my work addresses our water up here. I'm from the Great Lakes state, so we have 21% of the world's fresh water. Making work that addresses the issues, but also having work that you are known for, which gives you the opportunity to talk about those issues in places like here today, where you're not actually seeing the work, we're not actually, making it, but I am known for having those messages. So I get the opportunity to discuss it with you all here today, and also, maybe, remember, reinvigorate, something when we leave here of how we can all play a part. And also, maybe people don't know that 21% of the world's fresh water is in the Great Lakes in the United States. And, so just educating, I think, there's so much I still want to learn at my age even, and I feel like there's so much more knowledge out there to learn. And so just sharing knowledge is something that is important that we can continue to do to make sure we keep on the track that we need to stay on for the future generations.
Mayor, go ahead.
Let's see, question about design, that I think the first slide that you showed of my work has it's a beige and white checkerboard pattern. It's a very kind of clear pattern. But I like to include that one because if you look closely, you'll notice that there's a lot of variation within those two colors. And so it's actually made up of a bunch of small pieces of fabric that are kind of organized into this overarching composition. And for me, I really enjoy working with working with the material first, and from the material evolving a design rather than working in the other direction. It also just means that there's like endless inspiration. It's a real dialogue with the fabric. So when I'm designing, I'm really in my studio, tinkering with things and piecing them together. So, yeah.
Yeah, for me, surprisingly, I do have, I don't know if it's surprisingly or not. So I classify myself as a needlecraft artist. So in that, it's, I have a deep love affair with supplies. And over the years, I've decided that one of the things that I'm trying to do even more broadly, right, that like how do I live a more low waste, sustainable lifestyle? And what does that look like? What does that mean? How am I passing that to my family? And one of the things is using up the supplies that I have. I've been really lucky to be gifted things, and I've been able to buy things. But you know, instead of buying more thread for a specific project, I look at the thread that I have. I think similar to you, Mae, like I look at what I have and I craft a project through that. Versus trying to find the perfect shade of pink thread. Well, man, maybe this pink is going to be just fine because I also work really small. That's the other way that I think I've tried to keep it manageable, that I'm not doing these big, large pieces. And I enjoy a lot of the kind of repetition of it, but also recognize that like I can't be producing a lot, because then what does all that mean as well? So you know, really committed. I think what's happened in a lot of ways too, I think about it with my dance work, I think about it with my photography, I think about it with the poetry that I write, I think about it with, you know, even do I have to print that thing to read it? Can I put it on a device and read it that way? Can I, you know, how can I eliminate the weight and the burden that I'm putting on resources individually? And then how do we model that? So I think a lot to Kelly's point too, that it's about sharing the education. It's not, I feel like it's not just enough for me to do it and not tell anybody about it, but how do I do it? How do I share the information and knowledge that I'm gaining? How do I encourage others? How do I share resources for others as well? So I think, you know, in a lot of ways, the idea of I don't need new, I can repurpose, I can use up what I have, and it doesn't diminish my ability to be creative, has really been a hallmark over the last several years.
Thank you all. I'm mindful of time. And I just want to, say thank you, Kelly, Mae, and Ruby once again. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and I think for me really elucidated how important it is to, you know, approach work with mindfulness, care, and how that doesn't need to be separate from innovation and creativity in any way. So thank you all, and thank you to everyone in our audience for joining us. And I'm so grateful for this opportunity to have a lovely conversation over the midday hour.
Miigwech, thank you, everybody. Have a great day.